Hi everyone and welcome to our NQT webinar. I hope you're all well this evening. For those of you within your NQT year, you're obviously going to be past the halfway point now, so well done and keep going. Easter is in sight. For those of you searching for jobs, do remember that the support here at university is still available for you. So to introduce you to our panel tonight, I'm Louise Whitfield, NQT lead, and I have with me Kate Long and Dr. Sarah Trussler, two experts this evening, because we're going to be talking mainly around the topic of meeting the needs of all pupils. Obviously, if you do have other questions, that's also absolutely fine, but that's going to be our main topic, and Sarah's going to give a short introduction to that shortly. Also behind the scenes, we have Ian Wilson, who's doing everything techie this evening. There he is, our techie guru. So thank you to Ian for setting all this up ready so we can be with you this evening. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about today is something very exciting. We are currently arranging our first NQT conference. We are doing this in partnership with York University and York City Council. There's a bit of information about it. The group that I'm working with, we're the Yorkshire Teacher Enrichment Partnership, or YTEP as we're calling ourselves. And we're working collaboratively to organise a brilliant day of events for you. So this is going to be on the 10th of July, and it's going to be at York University, or the University of York should I say, and it's at a very reasonable price of £40 per delegate, so do get asking at your school if you would be able to have the time to come and attend our event. We've got two keynote speakers who are already booked to come and deliver to you, and then there's going to be a number of workshops during the day as well, and also refreshments and lunch and all those wonderful things that you get when you go on these lovely conferences. Further information is going to be sent out if it's not arrived at your school already, and if you would like to know more about this, please do feel free to email me as well, nqt@yorksj.ac.uk, and I can send further information out. There'll be some networking opportunities during the day as well for you to talk to other NQTs and RQTs, and we're going to have stands of different information and people to talk to you on the day as well. So do put it in the diary. It's the 10th of July at York University, and we really hope that you'll be able to join us. Places are limited, so if you can come, please do make sure that you book your place. So as well as that, keep looking out for our newsletters that come out regularly. Keep looking out for updates to the NQT website, and do keep in contact because we do like to hear from you. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who's going to talk to you a little bit about meeting the needs of all children, and from a very interesting perspective. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, so when we've got the first slide up, okay, the second slide then. So what I want to talk to you about is something called backwards planning, and what it means is keeping the end in sight but going back to meet the needs of all of the children within the classroom. The idea is that you don't treat your children in your class as separate groups, you treat them as individuals who are making the same journey but are doing it at their own pace. So we've split it up on this diagram to explain we're all going to Leeds, okay, and it's going to take us various lengths of time to get there from York, depending on whether we're cycling, going by car or using the train. Okay, if we're cycling, it takes 2 hours 23 minutes, but as you see we don't really get there because we only had an hour to start off with. The car starts a little bit further along the journey, and it just about gets to the outskirts of Leeds by the end of that hour. But if you were taking the train, you'd get there very early and have plenty of time for shopping and a coffee before everyone else arrived. Now, thinking about things that way makes you begin to look at the fact that the journey towards where we're all still going to the same place, but it's a very personal journey. And it's not about chunking children into 3 different groups and giving them different tasks. It's about thinking about how that journey is taken, whether you're cycling in a car or on a train. Now, just to put it in a research umbrella, if you like, Hattie, if you like to do reading round things, and I must admit I do, wrote a book called Visible Learning. And in that, he talks about the act of teaching being very deliberate interventions for children. And that's what you're doing here. You're taking us on that journey and you're making very deliberate choices about what the children are going to learn and how they're going to learn it, so that they can go along that journey as quickly as they need to. As well as that, if we can stay on the next slide, Ian, that would be great.
We're getting there. This
Okay.
one.
Yes, please. So we've swapped Leeds now, so we're not going to Leeds anymore, but we are heading towards a maths objective. I'm very conscious I'm now sat across from Ian. If I get that maths wrong, I'll tell you after. So we want everyone to head towards being able to use place value and number facts to solve problems. But again, we've got our cyclists, our car drivers and our train passengers going at different rates and through different journeys to get there. Now, what we need to think about is how the planning works for this. So with backwards planning, you keep the goal in mind. The goal remains the same, but you go back to the people who are furthest away from that goal to start your planning. So your cyclists are starting the furthest away from the goal, and their journey, as you can see by the arrows, sometimes goes forwards, sometimes goes backwards and then forwards again. So they're not getting as far in each session as the cars or the trains, but they are learning. And if you can remember to revisit and then move on, that learning will be really well embedded and they'll get to where they need to. So what I think you need to do after that, you know where they're going, you know what they have done. So in each box near to the cycle, the car and the train, you'll see prior knowledge. And the prior knowledge is what you know they have prior to starting this particular session or this week or whatever. Okay? And they all know or have experienced slightly different things because you've been doing backwards planning since the beginning of the year and you've got a very good handle on what the children know. We know from McCree's research, which is called Lean Lesson Planning, which is a very good book. It's very thin, it's easy read, so worth having a look at. But what he said is that, yes, you start with the end goal in mind, but you build on what they know, not on what they don't know. So you start the lesson or the week's activity with something that they know about. That builds confidence, but also if you know a little bit about your brain cell development, that myelin sheath needs to revisit and move on. So then you've got the focus for the session, which can be taken from the national curriculum. You just work back on a particular topic until you've reached the one that is relevant for that particular group. So our cyclists, for example, are going to work with higher numbers and get a bit more confident with their place value. The cars are going to work with numbers up to 100 because they're getting really good with their place value of 2-digit numbers. You'd like to see that a bit bigger. And the train passengers are going to work on greater depth and look at tackling word problems that involve place value. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that you may have some cars that catch the train up, and you may have some train passengers who are struggling. Now you're pushing them to greater depth. So if you've really carefully thought about all of the small steps that there are between what the cyclists can do and our end goal, you will have something there that can meet the needs of those children, even if it's not do more of the same, which we'd rather you didn't do. Okay, so that's really backwards planning in a few minutes. Open obviously to questions if everyone wants to ask them.
Just to say thank you, Sarah, because I think that's a really accessible approach and something that NQTs could very easily take on in their classroom to kind of understand how to differentiate much more easily. It makes sense. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Have we got any questions coming in at the moment, Ian?
Yes.
Lovely.
Hang on, because I've got my own camera. Yes. So it says, I have a child in my class who I think might have some special educational needs. Is it worth talking to the SENCO about this, or what advice would you give them to sort of like collect evidence or things like that?
Okay, probably coming to you, Mrs. Long.
So I guess if you think you've got a child in your class with SEND, the first thing that you need to be doing is assessing where they're at, assessing where their barriers to learning are. And that's done through identification, through assessment. It might be that there's lots of things that your school are able to do, that you're able to do in class, rather than just always thinking, I don't know what to do, I need to speak to my SENCO. So I suppose that depends on where you are in your teaching career. If you are early on, it might be that you do want the advice and guidance straight off from the SENCO. But hopefully as you get more confident in your teaching practice, you'll be able to field things off and be able to identify needs much easier and in a much quicker way. So I would be looking at where is it in the curriculum or in the area of school that the child is having the most difficulties, and talk to the child, get that pupil voice, and talk to the family as well, because you need to, I think it's so important that you get a holistic view of the child to make a full and thorough assessment, and also always knowing where it's a medical diagnosis and when it's something which is educational. If you've got parents talking to you about, I don't know, autism, it's a medical diagnosis. You need to be signposting your parents to their GP. But if it's something to do with education, you need to start that identification process, and that's where you start. That's where you need to start. What is the barrier to learning? And then you can start to think about what is the effective strategies. So yeah, do you speak to your SENCO? Depends on where you are in your journey.
I think that's really good advice, because as you say, in the early days, it's more likely that an NQT might want a meeting with the SENCO, might want a little bit of guidance of where do I go, but then later in your career you may have that confidence to tackle these things yourself a little bit more. I suppose that's what you found in yourself in your own career.
And it says very clearly in the Code of Practice, which is the legal framework which is kind of protecting our children with additional needs. It says very, very clearly that children are, it is the class teacher who is responsible for all of the children in their class, with the guidance of the SENCO and specialist support should that be required. So it is always there, but you are the expert. You might not feel it to start with, but very, very shortly you will.
And it sounds like she's got a good handle on what the issues may be. So can bear in mind that it's also what the child can do, and using that, because a diagnosis can take a long time.
Yep.
So it's worth not waiting for that.
And I think part of the question was about evidence, wasn't it? And just keeping that evidence of what you have tried and what hasn't worked, or maybe what has worked, so that if it does get to a point where you're applying for an EHCP or something like that, you've got that evidence there.
Yeah, but there's a very clear graduated response to SEND that your SENCO will support you with. So, you'll start off by thinking, is there something that I can do around quality first teaching in my classroom, before you're thinking about, is this child on the SEND register? So it's graduated, it's first things first.
I have another question which almost like follows on from that. The person has said a parent is concerned about their child and is trying to push them to be assessed and progressed with them. What advice would you give to the NQT to go about talking to the parent, etc.?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
This is very, very common. This is, and I would say increasingly more common. Our parents are getting more aware, more knowledgeable. There's lots of information out there for them to read up about and to ask advice about. So you will increasingly have parents on the front foot saying, this is a concern. I think that that my child has ADHD or autism. I would tend to say would be the two that you asked about. I refer back to my previous point. Both of those are medical diagnoses. So if the parent is convinced that that is a possibility, they are perfectly within their rights to go down a medical referral pathway. That's what they would need to do. But Sarah made a really, really valid point that separate to that, because that can be a very long and slow process, it kind of doesn't matter, because with SEND it should be needs focused rather than label or diagnosis focused. So regardless of a label, if a child has speech, language and communication needs, then you would support them in that area, whatever the label is. So again, identification, what is it, what are the main barriers to learning, and how can you support that? So let the parents do what they need to do if they want something formal, diagnosed, and you do what you need to do.
Yeah,
I guess what is really can be difficult is when the parent is seeing something quite different at home than what you are seeing at school. My advice is it's being really, really careful and honest with the language that you use. It is absolutely possible that the same child may be exhibiting different tendencies in different environments. That is not you saying that you think anyone isn't telling the truth, but it's you, in this environment, this is what I'm seeing. And I think that, you know, you've got to be honest about that. You're not saying that's wrong or that you're right. You're just saying that in my context, this is what I'm
so
seeing.
that you can see where that would cause tensions there.
It's not an easy conversation. I guess what is really important is to make it very, very clear that you are not saying that the information is wrong that's coming from the family.
Would you suggest that as an NQT, and I'm coming back to you with your experience as a Senka, would you suggest that for an NQT to have that conversation, perhaps have somebody else there with them as well?
I certainly did the first time I had that conversation, actually probably for the first couple or three times. And then I kind of got my confidence increased and I was able to increasingly have those conversations myself. You know, you're dealing with a family's most precious cargo and you've got to tread really, really carefully, but you always must tell your truth.
I think also that you've got to be careful that you don't try and make them happy by agreeing with them, because it's not a job of a teacher to diagnose any condition. So yes, you can say this is what I'm seeing, but be careful not to suggest, yes, you're right, it's autism, let's go.
Or not to make promises that additional things can be put in place.
Just another bit on language here, I would always be telling my students and NQTs, I'd be using the language of a child has autistic type tendencies rather than saying, I think this child is autistic. It is not our job at all to be making that sort of statement, so try and stay away from it.
I have another question. So it says, I have a strong inclination that one of my children has undiagnosed dyslexia. How should I go about supporting her and pushing this further to get a diagnosis?
Dyslexia is more of a complicated one, isn't it, in terms of diagnosis?
Yes and no. So all the local authorities that I'm aware of, they do not include, what the NHS does not include a diagnosis of dyslexia within their care pathway. So if it is something that a parent is wanting, as in that piece of paper that is saying, yes, this child has dyslexia, that is a private diagnosis. You're looking at quite a few pennies as well. You're looking at about £350 to £500 for a private diagnosis. So that is very restrictive in terms of families being able to afford that. I go back again to my previous point about autism. Regardless of the label, if the need is there, the provision should still be put in place. And I would be speaking to my SENCO, I'd be speaking to my literacy subject lead and saying, what do we do as a school for our dyslexic type learners? And there should be a strategy in place for that to be.
Did
So
they give the age of the child in?
No, but we can ask for the age. It was interesting just when you were saying that point, there's a question that says, how can I support the children who could possibly have a diagnosis? What should I do in the meantime without implementing dyslexic strategies when the child might not be? How would you suggest they support during that pre-diagnosis stage?
It's needs led. It's needs led. So if the child is really struggling with personal organisation, I don't need a piece of paper to be able to think that maybe some visual support and maybe some a visual timetable would be really helpful for that child. I don't need an expert to tell me that. So hopefully in your school you'll have something like whole school provision maps for different areas of need, of which dyslexia will be one, and that will have different options available to you in your setting. It might be that something like Lexia is an intervention that is on offer, but it might not be on offer in the school that you're at, so it's about finding out what you have. But any school should have a set protocol or a list of different options that might be appropriate to a child. And increasingly spelling strategies are being devised with dyslexic learners in mind as well.
I have some more information. The child is 8. They tend to mix or leave sounds out, leave out sounds and use incorrect suffixes. They also speak using incorrect sounds and easily get muddled up in conversations.
I'd make sure that they've had a hearing test.
Yeah.
That would be one thing that I would do there. I know it sounds quite blasé, but sight tests, hearing tests are always really, really important that we're ruling out. And just trying to work out whether or not accent's got anything to an issue, what sort of language is the child hearing at home.
It sounds like a speech and language could be.
So it could be a speech and language referral is appropriate within this as well.
It's just got a little bit more information. She is great at maths and does have some intervention sessions. But I think the next comment is what all the NQTs are trying to do. I just always worried that I could be doing more for her in the class. Any advice on that?
$1 million question. I guess in theory we could all be doing more for all of our children. I think it's about finding out what is the main barrier to learning and starting with that. Rome wasn't built in a day. If you find out what the main area is, and also going back to your backwards planning, if you know that what the long-term outcome is for that child, you can start working on small step progress towards getting there. You're not going to get there overnight, but you need to know where you're heading. So I felt that the model that you described for whole classroom differentiation and planning would be applicable for EHCP targets, for individual targets for our SEN children.
You know, there's 2 or 3 in the class who, for totally different reasons, have a very similar need, and therefore can work together on some occasions. For example, if she's brilliant at maths but struggling with her reading, might be that she sits with some children for maths and different children for reading.
Yeah, we all need our moment of glory, don't we?
We do, and you've got to be very careful with self-esteem and self-identity.
Yeah.
That if we keep separating children off because of need, then they're going to begin to identify as someone with a problem. So the more you can make it a smooth journey for everybody, the better.
And one journey, that's what I really liked in your message, is that it's not something special and different for this one person. We're all heading on in the same way, we're just doing it at a different rate, really.
I think something else to bear in mind during your NQT year is that you have that very precious NQT time, and that's not going to come back after this year. So think about how you're using that time. Don't just see it as additional PPA, but use it. So if you're thinking, actually, I'm perhaps not meeting the needs of all of the children in the most effective way, could you use that NQT time to spend some time looking through the school's provision maps, or spending some time with the Senka, or going and doing some observations in another classroom of what's actually happening in there. So use that time to meet your needs as well. I think that's really important.
Just Ian, on your point, is there any strategies you could suggest for the student? In this area, I would be signposting people towards the Communication Trust. It's got a wealth of information and free resources there, which I would be putting in. I call it my toolbox. I would be downloading and saving into my toolbox, so that because you will want them at some point in your career.
Okay, she replied, or they replied, sorry. Yes, her hearing was one thing I didn't rule out, but thanks very much for your help. And if you could send me that link,
The Communication Trust.
I'll put it in the show
Yep,
notes
okay.
underneath. Another question, which it's almost like you know what the questions are coming up, because you started to talk about it a bit. Somebody's got a child who is not succeeding, and they're differentiating the work, but the gap between them and the other children is getting bigger and bigger, and the child has started to become despondent, lack motivation, and their well-being, self-esteem is going down. What would you suggest?
I would be interested to unpick who thinks, what does success look like for that child, because if that child believes that they are not succeeding, it doesn't take Sigmund Freud to work out that they will not succeed. If that is their mindset, that they are unsuccessful, that is how things will be. They need to be very clear about next steps and what good can look like for them and how they're going to get there. And if it is that it's too big a jump, then of course they will feel unsuccessful. So I would be really looking at the pitch of lessons for that child to understand why is it that success doesn't seem to be part of what they feel that they do achieve or can achieve. The question worries me, to be honest with you.
I think what I've got a bit more information. They're saying that they're really sort of like supporting the child, but they're very much aware of the gap between them, the child is, what they're doing, which is very suitable for their learning, and what the rest of the class are doing, and that's what's causing the child to become despondent.
But again, going back to Sarah's point, if it's an understanding that it is one long journey, you're all on the same path. You're not doing something separate and something totally different. If you are the child who is constantly removed from that classroom, doing something entirely different, having to go into a classroom with maybe a lot younger children, you are not going to feel part of it. You're going to feel removed, different, and it doesn't bode well for the child's well-being long term.
We talk about SMART targets.
Yeah.
We talk about that a lot on the programme here. So I think if you think about it in terms of that, we're talking, it needs to be something that's achievable, it needs to be something that's realistic. So in order for that child to gain back the motivation and the self-esteem and so on, it needs to be those small steps that allow them to see that, yes, actually I can I can do this, allow them something that is achievable.
And also, it's looking at that child's profile to see where their strengths
Yes,
are,
and that's
their
what we were
relative
talking
strengths
about
are.
before.
So if they are that child that is very strong in maths, well, let's be celebrating that.
Yeah,
We need to be,
absolutely.
that child needs to know where their strengths and where their areas of development are. But I'd be looking back to zones of proximal development here. If it is not stretching enough, the child will be demotivated. If it is too much of a stretch, the child will feel unsuccessful. So it's just trying to pitch that right. Not easy.
You can put in place some things that affect all of the children's mental health. So put in some activities around, we use circle time, possibly not to its best. So maybe thinking about how you can use circle time activities, how you can just boost the children's understanding of self-esteem and their ownership of their learning and growth mindset. All of those ideas are very, very good ones for the whole class. And again, that's not separating that child and saying you are a problem. It's saying we all are on a spectrum for near enough everything, but there are ways of helping.
Pupil voice, I would
Mentally
say,
as
is
well.
absolutely vital within this.
We had I have a few questions that were sent in beforehand, and there's one that links very well to what we've just been talking about. I have a child in my class who has an EHCP. I've recently taken over the class and have been told by the previous teacher that I should not plan for him within my lessons, but plan completely separate work for his EHCP targets, not the topic or subject the rest of the class are working on. And the question is this common practice? But I suppose the other question that may arise out of this is when should those EHCP targets be worked on?
So EHCP targets are long-term outcomes. So you're looking at an end of key stage long-term objective. As a class teacher, you need to be looking at those long-term outcomes and saying, right, this is, again, Sarah, it links back to your journey. This is where the child needs to be by the end of year 6, say. We're in year 4, so this is how we're going to get there. So that's with regard to the EHCP targets. In terms of separate planning, I would always encourage there to be a real link between what the whole class are doing with what an individual child is doing. And 9 times out of 10 you can find those links rather than being separate in the back of the class or in a separate corridor or cupboard. There are a few instances where discrete and separate teaching is required, but it should, this is my opinion from experience, I think it should be kept to a real minimum and it should be part of the whole class journey.
Not the rule.
Yeah.
I have another question which I think, well, you will know the answer. Somebody has said, I'm really interested in special educational needs and disabilities. I would like to take it further, maybe becoming a SENCO in the future. What pathway should they do after their NQT? Obviously, they're still at NQT, but what would you suggest after that?
I would be badgering the SENCO. I don't think this will be a very, very hard task, and say, please, can I use some of my NQT time to shadow you, to work alongside you. An increasing number of schools are appointing assistant SENCOs or assistant inclusion managers, and that can be a really good stepping stone into middle leadership. If you want to be a SENCO, you have to do the postgraduate qualification, which I feel like it's a plug. It really isn't. It is. Which we have just started to offer at York St John University, which myself and my colleague Dr. Jonathan Vincent are running this year. Sarah, you're going to be joining the team next year.
Looking forward to it.
So that's where we give you the skills, the confidence and the forum whereby you can achieve that postgraduate qualification. that will give you 60 credits, which you then could put towards doing a SENI Masters, which we've also started at York St John Uni. So either a full-time route or a part-time route. Increasingly, our Senkos are they have to do the postgraduate qualification. It's non-negotiable. You need to do it within the first 3 years of being in role. But increasingly our Senkos are wanting to go on and do a Masters as well. And we would love to talk to our ex-students about how that might be possible for them.
We'll make sure that some information is sent out after the webinar along with the Communication Trust information, but we can send out some information about our Masters programmes as well, because I think that's really worthwhile looking into for those of you.
And having worked
passion.
with a couple of Senkos, they found it better to start the qualification as early as possible.
I did.
Not do it when they're at 2.5 years. Because it gives you so much information and guidance.
Yeah. I did it straight away, and it wasn't easy, but entirely possible. And we guide you all the way through it.
Any further questions, Ian? Not at the moment. Shall we have a look at our list then? There's a child in my class whose work is affected by issues at home. I understand that they do not have an SEN, but I have to highly adapt work to meet their needs. Should I be speaking with the Senko about this? So I suppose it's that line, isn't it?
Yeah, this sounds like it's more to do with pastoral and maybe bits and pieces that are going on at home. I'd be speaking to either the Senko or whoever is looking after family relationships, because it might be that some support might be required at home. And the local authority does have prevention services that can support the family, which is not a statutory referral, it's not social services, it's early support that can be given in the home, should that be required. But yeah, it might be that work is needing to be adapted to, it might be first thing in the morning when the child comes to school. That might be a really tricky time, transition. So I'd be wanting to work out, again, what specifically the child is needing support on, and then whatever that need is, supporting with appropriate strategies. But on this one, I would be wanting to look at the root cause as well.
Yeah, I think some learning mentors might have that underneath their broader remit than just SEND, but also family support workers that are based in schools. There's quite a lot of people in the teams now for team around the child, team around the family work, because it might be that if they are unable to do their homework, for example, because they don't have quiet provision or they don't have access to internet, etc. There could be all sorts of practical reasons for them not to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, pupil voice.
Sorry, I have another question. Somebody NQT is worried about the amount of time a child with SEND is being taken away from other areas of the curriculum. So they've got intervention, they say here, in art, and they're being taken out to do. What would be your advice to take this forward to ensure that the child has, in the words, a broad and balanced curriculum?
Yeah, and it's absolutely vital. It's so often that our most vulnerable children are taken out of the lessons where they might have their moment of glory that we've spoken about before. Again, I'd go back to pupil voice on this. I'd be wanting to work out with the child which interventions are the most important, because they shouldn't be being taken out for 2 or 3 interventions. I would be doing 1 intervention in isolation, and then maybe the next term move on to doing something else. I wouldn't be doing a number. And then I'd be trying to work with the child on the timetable, because if ICT is their thing, it really, really would be counterproductive to take that child out of that lesson. I had one example where the child just loved cookery, and that's where we were taking the child out. It's pointless, absolutely pointless. So yeah, I'd try to be creative with my timetable, and I'd try to look at which interventions happen first, second and third, rather than all at once. I go back to Rome was not built in a day. You can't do it all at once.
I think sorry, to give you a little bit more information, they feel that it's the SENCO is in charge of these interventions. So though, is it something that they should talk to the SENCO
Absolutely.
about and say,
Absolutely.
I think it's all to do with progression and, you know,
I think as an NQT it is hard to have those professional conversations with people who appear to have all the knowledge and of doing all of
and
the
there's a power dynamic in there as well.
Yeah, it is a difficult thing to do. But at the end of the day, you are responsible for your class. So, you know, if you feel that that child is missing out on something, then it is your role to say that, you know, is there a better way for us to do this?
As a ex-SENCO, I liked it when my NQTs came to me with solutions. So if they came to me saying, look, this child is coming out of this session, might it be possible for us to swap this intervention over with this time? That's quite a positive way of framing that type of question. And I know I've mentioned it a few times in this session, but pupil voice. Instead of you going to your SENCO saying, I think this, I think that, it's very, very powerful if you're able to say, I've spoken to this child, I've conducted some pupil voice, this is what they're really liking about their learning and this is what they're finding tricky. And if in the area of tricky is, I really don't like being removed from my class so much, well that's very powerful.
So that's a big part of the code of practice, pupil voice. And I think it's also important at times to put yourself in the shoes of that child and think, well, how would I feel if actually my favourite subject I'm being taken out of week in, week out to do something that I know the rest of the class aren't having to do. I think sometimes you've just got to put yourself in their shoes.
It's nearly 7 o'clock.
Oh,
so
wow.
But I wondered whether or not you could sum up how, in a couple of sentences, how best to support children with SEND in the class. Almost like parting comments.
Talk to them. You talk to them, find out what is their, what are they good at, and build on what they're good at, and find out what they want to be better at, and build on that. Small steps is really, really important with SEND. But I really like your point about not labelling. Because when we label, we put on ceilings and we tell our children this is as good as you will be. And who knows how when a child will suddenly flourish and develop. It may not be, might not have happened before, but yeah.
Needs led rather than label.
Yeah.
Led.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Anything from yourself?
Well, you said everything, haven't you?
Sorry.
But that's why you're here as our SEN experts. That's fine.
It's these worms that have given me all the answers.
It's getting to know the children, I think, for me.
And the family,
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah,
Is
building
there
trust.
anything from well-being, Sarah? Because I know that's your...
Yes, we could do another hour or two
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
we
well-being,
could.
but I think it's worth remembering that children do have mental health issues, and that part of SEND is recognising how it impacts on their emotional and mental well-being, as well as how it impacts on their educational outcomes.
I think that's come through on quite a few of these
Yes, it
questions
has.
as
Yeah.
well, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think if we do schedule one on mental health, that would be extremely useful.
We can certainly do that. Well, I can't believe how quickly the time's gone this evening. Thank you ever so much for those of you who've tuned in and for all your questions both during and before the webinar as well. If you have got any more questions, if you'd like to email the NQT inbox, I can quite happily pass those on to our experts here and get back to you. So please do keep in touch. Remember the conference as well that I flagged up to you, 10th of July. And again, if you want more information, if you haven't got the flyer, please do email in. So finally, thank you. Huge thanks to Ian behind the scenes. Do you want to give everyone a wave, Ian? No, he
'cause
doesn't. No, he doesn't. Okay, that's fine. But we will give you a wave. Thank you very much for tuning in. Good night.
Thank you.